Shalom and welcome. It's Adar. It's Purim. Happy Purim. An interesting holiday and an interesting reading. For Purim, we are supposed to read Megillat Esther, the book of Esther. And this is in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh. And it's an interesting day with its own traditions and an interesting story that has some interesting points. Among the traditions we have on this day, you're supposed to get not drunk, but let's say happy with wine or other spirituous drinks. But only to the point where you can't tell the difference between Mordecai and Haman. When Mordecai's name is mentioned, you're supposed to cheer, yay, blessed be Mordecai. And when Haman's name is mentioned, you're supposed to say, boo, cursed be Haman. But you're supposed to eventually be so happy with the drink that you get confused and you start blessing Haman and cursing Mordecai. Another interesting tradition is that in the Torah, there's a commandment that says a man cannot wear a woman's garment and vice versa. But on Purim, this commandment is suspended. You're permitted to wear the clothing of the opposite sex. Perhaps that's to facilitate people dressing up in costume, where men can dress up as Esther or Vashti, and women can dress up as Mordecai or King Ahasuerus, even Haman if the Spirit so moves them. And the reading. There's some interesting things about the Megillah itself. First and foremost, there is no direct mention of God anywhere in the book of Esther. Not any kind of direct reference. God is not mentioned. Alluded to, perhaps. We can certainly see the hand of providence, or perhaps the hand of God, in the actions of the people, but never actually mentioned. Only book in the Hebrew Bible that does not mention God, which begs the question, why was it put in the first place? Subject for a completely different study. And then there's the characters in the story. Esther, the heroine, whose real name is Hadassah. We find that out early in the book. But she goes by the name Esther, which interestingly enough means hidden. Of course, she hides the fact that she's Jewish. So maybe there's something to be drawn from that. And her uncle, Mordecai, who kind of just pops into the story. Firstly, Mordecai is not a Hebrew name. If anything, it's Babylonian in origin. The name of the primary Babylonian god was Marduk, and Mordecai is related to Marduk. Interesting, but again, why? It's kind of odd. And then there's the fact that Mordecai is encountered at the village gate, the city gates. What? He's not just some schlepper, some guy who's just hanging around. People didn't just hang around at the city gates. In ancient times, there was a lot of government business that was done at the city gates. Strangers coming into the city were asked what their business was by the guards. There were always guards at the gates. Commerce was many times transacted at the city gates. Collection of taxes. As merchants brought their goods into the city, there might have been a tax and it was collected at the gates. Government officials conducted business at the city gates. And judges dispensed justice at the city gates. So somebody who's present at the city gates, who's not just walking in or out of the city, is somebody who's got some business there. And since Mordecai was not mentioned as being a litigant or a merchant bringing goods in, he's in some way connected with what's happening at the city gates. So he's not just some hoo-ha who's wandering around at the city gates. He has some purpose of being there, which implies that he's perhaps some kind of maybe low-ranking official of some kind. And then there's the villain in the story, Haman, who's described as being a conniver, a plotter, what we would call today an anti-Semite. He decides that he's going to get really on the good side of the king. He's the king's vizier, the king's second in command. Very high rank. He has the king's signet ring, which means he can issue orders as if they came from the king. And he issues an order that all the Jews are to be killed, and all on the same day. How does he choose this day? He casts lots. Persian for lot is poor. And so we have the name of the holiday Purim, which actually means lots. Like, gambling. And as we know in the story, this plot gets foiled through the machinations of Mordecai and Esther. But you can just picture Haman sitting there grinning and twirling a mustache. A classic villain. And then there's the king. The king is sometimes portrayed as a kind of a drunken fool. But he's really not. He should kill the original queen in the story Vashti for disobeying him, but he simply banishes her. So he has some kind of compassion. In the end, he's the one that decrees that Haman be killed instead of the Jews. So he's got some sense of fairness and honesty as well. So it's kind of a classic story. And it's got machinations, and it's got assassination attempts, and it's got this conniving villain who's trying to slide things past the king, or at least convince him that he should have his way. He has like 10 or 12 sons. When we read the story, especially if children are present, we don't read it all the way to the end. So I encourage you, get out a Hebrew Bible, a Tanakh in English. Read the story of Purim. Read the book of Esther. It's not very long. And it's kind of exciting. It's a fast read, really. But read it all the way to the end. It has kind of a surprise ending all the way at the end. I think you'll find it very enlightening. Now, in our tradition, it's a mitzvah, a commandment, to hear the reading of the Megillah, which puts me in mind of a short story. There was once a Rabbi Reb Shalom of Belz, who was reputed to read the Megillah with such intensity and fervor. It was like nothing anyone had ever heard before. He did this year after year. In fact, his Rebbe, when he was young, who became the Rebbe in Lublin, once asked him to read the Megillah. And he turned to one of his other disciples afterward. He said, hey, I've heard this story many times, but never the way this young man reads it. So time goes on. Reb Shalom has two sons, Reb Ishmael and Reb Elazar. Now, this particular year, they're traveling, they're on their way home. It's almost Purim. The fast of Esther is upon them. Now, we're supposed to have a fast day the day before Purim to remind us of this almost tragedy. But they're not home. There's no way they can get home. They have to stay in a small village at an inn. And they go to hear the reading of the Megillah, and it's a simple Jew, a householder, who reads. Now, he reads, and it's fine. But Reb Elazar says to his brother, I'm disappointed. It's not like hearing our father read the story. And I'm really disappointed we weren't able to get home. His brother looks at him. He says, I disagree. This is the first time that I've been able to hear the story of Purim. And I haven't been distracted by the way the story is told. Our father does a great job, but part of my mind is always on the intensity and the excitement that his reading puts into it. Yet today, I was able to fulfill the mitzvah of hearing the Megillah without any other motive than to fulfill the mitzvah. So we should all be like Reb Ishmael. Fulfill the mitzvah, but have any kind of ulterior motive for doing it. That we will feel good because something good will happen, that we're doing it for some other kind of gain, whatever. And that goes for all of the mitzvot, not just for the reading of the Megillah. Happy Purim.